This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. You can subscribe to this podcast by going to our Substack page, and there's a link to subscribe in our episode description. So please consider taking out a paid subscription, and you'll get free downloads at the beginning of the month and some other goodies during the year. Rosalyn Tureck, who lived from 1913 until 2003, was known as a Bach specialist primarily, although she did actually play a very wide-ranging repertoire in her younger days. By the early 50s, her primary focus on recordings and in concert was centering around the keyboard works of J.S. Bach. I've talked in previous podcast episodes about how Rosalyn Tureck's thoroughly worked out and thoroughly thought out and thoroughly processed Bach interpretations could sometimes have a hothouse quality about them, with more than a few touches of pedanticism and a super serious attitude that precluded any joy or humor. It was as if this so-called high priestess of Bach needed to get out of the temple more often. Certainly that was true in the later part of her career. I mean, I remember hearing her play the Goldberg Variations in 1990 at New York's Temple Emmanuel. I think that was the temple. And I was sitting right in the middle, and her tempos were so damn slow, and she was accenting every downbeat as if she was hitting me with a ruler, like ba da da ba 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 ba. Oh man, the whole performance was just going on like this, and with all the repeats, and I just wanted to die. And because I was sitting in the middle of the hall, which was totally packed, I couldn't leave. Oh my God, how I suffered. But that wasn't the case when I heard Rosalyn Tureck play the Goldberg Variations when I was 15 years old or something like that, where she played it first on the harpsichord, and then there was a dinner break, and then she played it on the piano, and this was at Carnegie Hall. And this was my first live experience with the Goldberg Variations, and I was just totally mesmerized. And in the mid-1970s, I had the good fortune to hear Rosalyn Tureck play a series of concerts devoted to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and those concerts were amazingly memorable. I mean, her sound just filled the room, and the contrapuntal clarity just really spoke out. I will never forget those concerts. But it was when I was a student in the 1970s that I first became acquainted with her 1952 and 1953 recordings of the Well-Tempered Clavier. These were originally released on the American Decca label on LP. Now, I never owned the original mono LP pressings, but I remember that I found a reissue that Decca had brought out, I think in the late 1960s, I'm not sure. But these were transfers that were electronically processed in fake stereo, so they didn't sound as good as the original monos. I think I found these in a bargain bin in some New York record store. I can't remember which one. So we're talking about the 1970s, so it could have been King Carol or the Sam Goody Budget Annex or Dayton Records on 8th Street. Actually, it was more likely the Dayton Records branch on Broadway and 12th Street, which was across the street from the Strand bookstore. I also remember that on CD in the 1990s, I think that this Italian magazine brought out the Well-Tempered Clavier, these Decca recordings, in not very good CD remasterings, but that was all we could get. But then I remember I saw that Deutsche Grammophon had reissued them in 1999, and I saw a copy of this in a record store in Luzerne, Switzerland, and I figured, are these ever going to turn up in the United States? Probably not. So, of course, I bought them on the spot because I wasn't sure if they'd be reissued at home. But, of course, they were reissued maybe like 3 or 4 months later. And, of course, I could have gotten a free review copy had I been patient. Anyway, it doesn't matter because I was happy to have the recordings. And then when Deutsche Grammophon reissued the Well-Tempered Clavier again in a Tureck Plays Bach box set that also included her 1997 Deutsche Grammophon Goldberg variations, I was asked to contribute the booklet notes, and I did. So what makes these 1952 and 1953 American Decca Well-Tempered Clavier recordings so special? First of all, the sheer finish of Rosalyn Tureck's pianism in her prime and the absolute focus and definition of her sonority and her extraordinary micro shadings of dynamic levels. I mean, her finger independence and her contrapuntal acumen is really amazing. And no matter how transparent or how thick the fugal textures may be, and no matter how many voices are in play, Rosalyn Tureck not only clarifies and shapes each line, but she follows through each line to its logical stopping point with no untoward accents. Is that the right word, untoward? But with no unintended accents, that's a better word, and totally oblivious to bar lines and no bumps in the road at all, so to speak. She is particularly hypnotic in slow minor key preludes, spinning out long lines that just quiver with harmonic tension, like the B-flat minor prelude or the C-sharp minor prelude in Book 1. Each and every phrase, each tempo, and each choice of ornament seems to have been pored over and worked out and processed through a sieve, I guess. Every dynamic is calibrated to the nth degree, yet with the utmost subtlety. It doesn't sound contrived, even though there is a lot of study and contrivance, I guess, by definition of this kind of playing. But there are so many examples that I can cite, but the one performance from this release that I often use as a sample of Rosalyn Tureck's artistry whenever I give a talk about Bach on the piano, or whenever I want to turn someone on to Rosalyn Tureck who has not heard her Bach, I used the C-sharp minor fugue from Book 2. The fugue subject is in triple meter, and it has the quality of a dance, and you can imagine this fugue as the conclusion of a partita, maybe. Anyway, she plays the exposition with the subject and the answers perfectly articulated, but also with the dynamic levels of each line carefully calibrated for contrast. And in the fugue episodes, Tureck imposes diminuendos that are so gradual that you barely notice them. I mean, the architecture of the performance is so meticulously pinpointed, but the music always retains its qualities of dance. And also listen to the E minor fugue from Book 1, which is almost like a toccata. But here, Tureck takes it in a rather measured tempo, but it really works because her legato control and her super worked out interweaving of voices totally hold your attention. And there is one instance in this series of recordings where her tempo increases gradually as the music unfolds, which was a rare occurrence for Tureck. Often the opposite would happen with this pianist, like in almost all of her live surviving performances of the fugue from the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue. Usually the textures get thicker and slower. It doesn't happen in her studio recording for Columbia Masterworks, by the way. But in this recording of the A minor fugue from Book 1, Tureck begins the piece in a rather dour mode, hitting you over the head with her proclamatory détaché articulation of the fugue subject. Ba 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 da 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 da. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. However, instead of getting thicker and slower as the music unfolds, the textures actually lighten up over the course of the performance, and the tempo increases, not by much, but clearly that stone face is melting away. And this is a fugue where the close-lying counterpoint is very hard to keep in balance. And in the wrong hands, the fugue can sound overlong, like it's overstaying its welcome. And I have heard so many ponderous and boring performances of this fugue, but Tureck really, really, really holds your attention. So the bottom line is that there's really nothing quite like Rosalyn Tureck's 1952 and 1953 Bach well-tempered clavier recordings, and her integrity and her concentration and her attention to detail all add up to a unique pianistic voice in this music. And when you listen to these recordings, you can get the sense that a pianist could easily aspire to and draw upon Tureck's interpretations for ideas. However, she's really impossible to imitate. So if you haven't heard Rosalyn Tureck's American Decca Bach well-tempered clavier, you do need to check it out. And whether or not you respond to her conceptions, they are unique and they are not easy to ignore or keep out of your mind once you've heard them. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I look forward to being with you for our next episode. Be well and take care.